下一个分享的是Domen Bremec，他是体育科学硕士，然后主要执教的是手球、足球、网球和篮球等运动项目的身体准备练习。目前担任的职务是巴林手球联合会的体能主管，然后也在运营一个斯洛文尼亚的 Super Training Performance 的网站。他今天跟我们分享的题目是竞技训练中的练习分类与实施。
Hi, my name is Domen. I'm the current head of strength and conditioning with Bahrain national handball team, as well as the co-owner of the Super Training Sport Performance Center from Celje, Slovenia. Today I will talk about exercise classification and implementation into athletic training. We will touch upon topics like classification of the exercises, qualities and methods, as well as periodization. I think this topic is both interesting and important for the young and novice coaches, as well as the ones more experienced. Another important note I would like to make is that today's presentation is meant more for strength generalists, which are your typical team, field or ball sports, as opposed to strength specialists, which are weightlifters or powerlifters. First, I would like to cover the goals of today's presentation. Our presentation today will be in three main parts. First part will be exercise classification, where we will talk about why is that important to classify the exercises, how is it traditionally done, and what is a more modern or contemporary approach to classification. Second part will touch upon qualities and methods. We will talk about the difference between one and the other. We will introduce a simplified versus realistic model, and we will also talk about classification of the qualities and methods themselves. We will wrap it up with the topic of periodization, how to use classification and qualities and methods in a periodized plan. We will introduce the concept of agile periodization, and we will introduce or talk about top-down and bottom-up approach to periodization, as well as the concept of MVP. Let's go. First, I would like to talk about classification. Why is it important? Why we need it? Our main aim with it is to get easier orientation and action for us, the coaches, the practitioners. So basically, it's just there to make our lives of planning and training easier, more understandable, and more actionable. Another important note here I would like to make that the classes or categories should be so simple that they're easily explainable to maybe the head coach, the athlete, or any other coach, so they shouldn't be complicated, they shouldn't be very difficult to understand. We have to realize that there is no objective or unbiased approach to categorization. All it matters is how we intend to use those classes or categories. So we have to look at who are we working with, what type of sport or athlete or team we have in front of us, and from that standpoint we decide how we're going to categorize our exercises. What we plan to use it for, is it a team sport, is it a track and field sport, or is it powerlifting or weightlifting? As I said before, the functional significance part is very important. So you want to use the categories you have somehow. So you need to go as deep or be as detailed to still keep the functional significance of the class or the category you have. Once there is no functional significance, you stop categorizing. You don't need that category if it doesn't offer anything to you in practice. This will get maybe a bit more easier to understand with the practical cases that we will talk about a little bit later. So we have two important concepts to look at the classification of the exercises. One is so-called place of things, the other is forum for action. Basically, place of things classifies phenomena relative to some objective criteria. For example, if you remember your typical sports science textbooks, the criteria is usually physiological, anatomical, or biomechanical. Another way to do things is forum for action, which is just a fancy word or fancy term to refer to the classification based on how do you intend to use these classes in your planning, in action, in your intervention, in your training intervention. So basically, why do you need them for? Another thing we have to realize is that there is no true or false statements, as we will see on the next slide, with an example of split squat. Membership of a certain exercise can be a bit fuzzy or going to keep a certain exercise. Just keep it in one category, and this is it basically. Don't worry about too much if it is in one and could be in the other one as well. Yeah, just the question is split squat a double leg or a single leg movement. For some would say double leg, some would say single leg. Nothing is wrong or correct basically here. Both can be correct, depends on the criteria you take to classify those exercises. So we do this, why? Because we want to make things simple, as we said before. Simple for us to use, simple for us to understand, and simple for us to explain to coaches or athletes we're working with. So even if you will look at, I posted an interesting link to the force plate measurements from Alex and Tara, who use different implements such as barbell, dumbbell, and Smith squat, Smith machine to measure the load distribution between the legs in a split squat. So you decide what it is and keep it there, keep it simple. As we said before, or this is maybe a bit more obvious example of precision versus significance conundrum, which just means that you need to be, in this case, significant. You don't have to be exactly precise in your classification of the exercises. You need to be significant, you need to be understandable, you need to be simple. So basically you need to know what are you going to do with a certain exercise or a certain class of exercises that you have, how do you plan to use them, and for whom. This is the only question you need to ask yourself. Some more examples of how the exercises can be classified, or basically anything can be classified, depends on the criteria we use, and this is how you do your classification. Here we have different examples for classifying different things. Next, I would like to talk a little bit about the methods and qualities. If you remember, the commonly used coaching education material or material used at the universities, those standpoints that is using the so-called objective biomechanical or physiological approaches, it's not so objective. It's biased, highly biased, and it's not objective. This is one thing we have to realize. There is nothing wrong with it. We just have to be aware of it. So, for example, because our field is dominated by physiology and biomechanics, those fields have monopoly on defining what exists out there. So what kind of qualities and methods are there? For example, your typical maximal strength, explosive strength, VO2 max, anaerobic capacity, aerobic power, and so on and so on. So we just have to be aware that this is not objective, and there is no objective way to classify or to define methods and qualities, as well as there is no objective way to define your exercises, as we were talking about before. So you have to engage the phenomena of classification the way you experience it. And there is nothing wrong or nothing to be embarrassed about your subjectivity. So this is not a problem. Another important point I would like to make is, of course, you need to know your anatomy, you need to know your physiology, you need to know your biomechanics. The knowledge of that is absolutely necessary and welcome, but it is not sufficient for total understanding. Again, if we assume that there is an associated training method or intensity zone even that will magically hit some quality that we have identified on a certain athlete, this is just a dream. There is no way for us to be able to do that. So because the causal network, what and how one thing affects the other, is very complex and very interconnected. And as we said before, we have to realize and accept that fact. We're just experimenting and using a case-by-case approach. Why is this important? Because with every new athlete, with every new team, with every different sport, you have a new case, you have a new experience that you can use to update your previous knowledge, previous understanding, and have a wider net of understanding of the exercise methods, qualities, exercise classification, and as well as planning. So all of the priors that we're using, for example, scientific studies, best practices, old school methods are a very good starting point in our experimentation and updating process. So basically they just help us set the direction where we want to go, or what do we know about a certain thing, or what has been done. And obviously, as you're a younger coach or more new to this, obviously you need this very much, because then it's easier for you to know where you want to go or set the direction that you will go. But at the same time, we have to realize this is not the only way, because there is always a new case and we're always experimenting. So this is a good starting point. Read the articles, be aware of the practices used for a certain problem that you're trying to solve. Old school methods have been here for a long, long time. Why? Because they're working. If they wouldn't be working, they wouldn't be here anymore. The methods that haven't been working, they are not being used anymore today. So this is just something we need to be aware of. I will talk a little bit about a certain example of a powerlifter against a team sport athlete. Basically, different individuals means different quality identifications. If we take an example of a bench press for a powerlifter is his competitive exercise, or his competitive lift. So that means that if he's bench pressing on training, he will be bench pressing on the competition as well. If we take an example of, I don't know, tennis or a football player, well, yes, they will be using the bench press to become stronger, to become better, but it will not directly affect their performance, or they will not directly do that on the field, court, pitch, whatever. So different individuals will manifest different phenomena, and they will demand different qualitative identification. So that just means that we have to look at the sport we have to look at the individual we have, and we have to look what is important for his sport, what is he doing there, and go from there. So how we experience our forum for actions. So this is obviously a very used or often seen table of methods and qualities that you usually see in textbooks or on presentations. Let's call this a simplified model. Basically, a certain method affects a certain quality. This is it. Use this percentage of RM, you will work on this, with this, and this. Now here we have a few issues with that. Let's talk about them. The first one, as we said before, that this is a reductionist approach, which is dominated by two fields of physiology and biomechanics. Again, nothing wrong, but they define the place of things. We assume that we know what to do with it. So, for example, okay, we have somebody who needs better explosive strength or rate of force developments, and this is the method. We will use the dynamic effort method. If things were that simple, I think we would see athletes training by themselves and continuously improving. Now, I will talk about two main issues with this model. First one, the qualities that we have identified are usually related to some physiological model of performance. For example, if you take endurance, you have VO2 max, you have lactate threshold, you have economy, and of course, the, the qualities will get measured by those performance measurements. So this is one problem, and the second problem is we immediately assume that once we have identified certain qualities that a certain athlete needs, there are specific training methods or training zones or intensity zones that will hit those qualities. And obviously there is a problem here. This model includes some flaws. Because let's talk about a practical example. If based on this model, we believe that if I want to improve maximal strength of my athlete, I need to use the loads as we've seen above 85 or 90% of RM. There is a problem with that. You have many cases of very strong, let's take powerlifters from the renowned coach Boris Sheiko, where usually or often lifting lower weights than 80% of RM, and they're still incredibly strong, and they're still setting personal records constantly. So this doesn't work. The theory doesn't match with the practice in this case. And the categories create certain paradoxes because they sometimes make us falsely confident that we are involved in the process of that leads to a specific goal. So we feel that, yeah, with this method we will improve this quality 100%, but we have to be aware that this is not the case. This is not 100%, or I would say not even 90% like that. So we have to realize that we are dealing with complex systems and a lot of uncertainties. Now, here I present a more realistic model of qualities and methods, where we see that everything here is related and connected. Obviously, one things are more connected or have a higher R squared than the others, but still the connection is there. So we have to update our model, as we said before, and rather than rely only on physiology and biomechanics to define what there is, we take more pragmatic, more practical approach and in thinking what we should do with or about it. So that just means that, okay, we will use a certain method to improve a certain quality, but at the same time we will realize that with this method we're also affecting other qualities and that there are different or other alternative ways to improve certain qualities. So, like I said before, we're constantly experimenting, we're constantly using a case-by-case approach. As pointed out before, of course, studies, practices, old school methods, those things are very, very useful, but we still have to be aware that this is just experimentation and we're in a land of uncertainty. So they're a good starting point and a good thing to keep in mind, a good thinking model, but you have to constantly update, you have to constantly experiment and update your thinking and planning process. So there's no certainty, only assumptions. Let's talk a little bit more about exercise classification, but a little bit more pragmatic or from a practical standpoint. So if we assume that all exercises exist in general to specific continuum, basically we use general exercises to develop some innate quality by overloading the system, and we use the specific exercises to express or realize that potential through skill development, which is your technical training and so forth. So but at that time, we have to realize that, for example, for a powerlifter, this is much less complex than it would be for a team sport, for, I don't know, a tennis player with a tennis serve, or a football player, or whatever ball or field sport you take. And obviously, there are some issues with whose job is to do a certain thing. So, okay, we all probably agree that this is the job of strength and conditioning coach. On the other hand, whose job is to develop this part, the specific part? Is that the job of the strength and conditioning coach or the job of the sport or technical coach? You have different ways of approaching this. I will not talk about who should do it, decide for yourself, but it's just an interesting thing to keep in mind and to realize. Okay, this is a quote that has been in the media a while ago and was just said by a head coach, I think a football head coach, that players never squat in a game. What should your response or stand in this case be? Basically that you're looking to improve the general, not the specific. So why they need it? They need it, A, to improve performance, and B, to protect from the downside, as Mladen likes to say. Basically, probably your biggest downside are injuries. Injuries lead to missing the training, and not attending the trainings is the main detriment to not improving an athlete. So basically, we look at this from a general standpoint, not from specific standpoint. Another thing to keep in mind here is that some sport coaches like to, let's say, make things the way they want them to see, because sometimes they see some some things as very specific. On the other hand, they see some things as very general. An example here is the conditioning. If some are still using conditioning that is non-specific to the sport, why are they using it if here they argue that they don't squat on the pitch or on the field? So this is some food for thought. Okay, this is probably the model that has been used or shown a lot, especially in the track and field circles by Dr. Anatoly Bondarchuk. Basically, he extended the previous model of specific general to add a few more categories on his continuum. And basically, his system is that all exercises exist on a spectrum from general to specific and can be placed into one of these four categories depending on different characteristics. So this is your typical GP, SP, SD, and CE. And basically only up here we're talking about the competitive movement pattern, and down here we're talking about the physiological system. This should probably or could extend down here, especially for team sports as well. The thing here is that this is a very useful model for a track and field event or metric events, while not so much for team or ball sports. Let's see why. So I think this is a good, let's say, model to have to do for your sport, because it helps you categorize, for example, speed, power, and other strength and conditioning components, and is a useful tool in the toolbox. As we said before, more useful for strength specialists or for track and field, but the deal breaker for a more complex sports here is that categories we have. So, for example, I mean, for handball, sprinting, jumping, contact play, and shooting depend on what we use to judge the specificity. What is specific in handball? What is specific in football? What is specific in tennis? So basically, you will make those categories and decide what is specific in your sport. So the exercises for a football player will be very different than exercises for a powerlifter, for example, and where they would be. So another thing to keep in mind that most of the exercises for a team sport or ball sport will be here in GP and SP. Very few will be down here, or they will differ. If we take those two categories, most of the exercises for a certain sport will be same or very similar between me, who works in handball, and another strength and conditioning coach who works in handball. While those two, well, they will differ. They will be different between me and more, and very hard to pinpoint exactly which are those. So I think this strategy or this kind of classification is useful for general viewpoint to maybe get a better idea and better insight, but not very useful for team sports in detail. Okay, here is another different way of classifying, basically based on importance. All those examples are from powerlifting and maybe also weightlifting, but basically again up to you, up to the coach to define what are the main categories you will have in certain class. Okay, and we have arrived for the categorization which is probably currently the most useful for team or complex sports, and is probably also quite widely used, at least maybe a little bit more in detail concerning the grinding movements. What we do here, we create biggest forum for action. So who are we working with and what, which will guide our decision making and help us decide what are the big buckets or the training slots that we have to, or planning slots that we have to take care of. So this is a very good model for strength generalists. We will look a little bit more in detail into each category, into grinding, ballistic, other, and control. And we will look into each of these categories a little bit more in detail, but just a quick recap. Basically, grinding movements are your slow, controlled, compound movements with constant tension. So think of squats, bench press, deadlift. ballistic movements are fast and explosive with a burst of tension uh, followed by relaxation, and sometimes or usually involve the flight phase of the body or the implement. So just think jump squats, hang cleans, medicine, ball throws, things like that. Then we have our control movements. Basically, think of the movements that include or work with the local global stabilizers. They have a lot of similarity to complex movements, but they demand some symmetry or stabilization, things like that. And then you have the other category, basically that category where the exercises that you don't know where they would fit in, you put them in this category. Again, this could be more detailed, more complex, more categories for you, or even more simple than this. So, as with any kind of categorization, it is very hard to draw a line between categories because there are so many similarities between them. And again, it's up to you, to your criteria, to decide what the lines between them are. Most common or fundamental human movements, I think this is quite often seen and used for the grinding part of the movement. Ballistic, very similar because anatomy is similar. The difference is that we include the rotation category instead of carry, slat, and core categories. As we said before, grinding movements, your typical slow, controlled compound movements, squats, deads, bench press, and so on. How you will categorize them in more detail, again, it's up to you. I think this is quite enough in detail, at least for most coaches working with strength generalists. I think this should be more than enough. Here we have an example of ballistic movement. So we said some explosive stuff, tension, relaxation. Um, Again, those categories are similar. We have included Olympic lifts and sled categories and rotation categories as mentioned before. Um, Now let's talk a little bit about the classification of the methods and qualities. For example, this may be a bit of contradiction to what I was talking before, but what I was talking before was not meant to say that everything, all the tables, all the models we have are to be forgotten and to be thrown out. No, they are useful and very, let's say, make our lives easier basically, and easier to understand how things are connected in a way, or how our planning should be, or how it will go. So this is just an optional table that I have modified for myself, for my sports, for my athletes that I use. So you can do it differently, again, in less detail, more detail, up to you. And always keep in mind, this is not the only method to improve this ability, and this is not the only rep range and set range and intensity and velocity to improve this quality. There are other ways. This is what I find useful currently. Maybe in 1, 2, 3 years, I will again update it, see different, make different experiments, see different cases, and maybe the table will look, or probably will look, a little bit different. Another example, this is just an example of my way for my current needs, of my builder that I have made, and this is an example for lower body, squat, double leg, bilateral movements, using different implements or equipment that you have. Again, up to you how you will do it. There are many, many different ways how to do this. Okay, so we have come to our last part of periodization. We will introduce some concepts. If you know them, great. If not, maybe look into them after this presentation. Also, if you need, basically agile periodization is just a planning framework that relies on decision making and uncertainty. While most common, your normal periodization is based on ideology, physiology, and biomechanical constructs. As we said, there is nothing wrong with it, just maybe we need to update that kind of thinking a little bit. because most of the current planning is based on predictive responses and linear reduction analysis, which just means, okay, you start with this phase, followed by that phase, followed by this phase, and ending the phase, ending the planning with this phase. Well, obviously there is a problem with that because we're dealing with uncertain and complex domains, such as human performance or human adaptation is. We'll talk about more practical approaches or cases in the coming slides. Before we do that, let's explain those two models or concepts of top-down and bottom-up. So top-down is how things are most often introduced in the textbooks or in theory. Basically, you think about what should be done and why. You have some kind of a big picture in front of you. You have some kind of a vision what you want to do with a certain athlete or team. And you're deciding about goals, objectives, and strategies to achieve those goals and objectives. While on the other hand, we have bottom-up planning, where we think a little bit more pragmatic and we think what can be done and how. So basically, we're faced with the problems that we have. Those include the facilities we're working in, the equipment we have available, the level of athletes, what they know, what they can do, what they cannot do, how much time we have, how often, basically things like that. What is the understanding of the head coach for strength and conditioning work and so on. Also, another important concept is the concept of MVP, which is minimum viable program. Basically, that's just the program that you will do in the meantime while you're trying to figure out what you have to do, what can be done, what should be done, and why. Basically, in practice, we usually start from here and move down here. How it should be, start here and move up here as you're working and progressing with the team or with the athletes and you get to know them better and better. Let's talk about the MVP a little bit. Basically, our MVP or our program, while we're figuring out what we have to do on the long term, has to include all the qualities that we have identified as important. So think that there will probably be some speed or some sprint work, some jumps, some quality lifts, maybe some work for certain often injured areas in certain sport, things like that. Basically, a little bit of everything that you know will work and you know that this certain sport athletes needs. Basically, this is just an epitome of the precision significance conundrum we have been talking about before at the beginning for the exercise classification. Basically, you have to be significant. You have to know what you're going to do, even if you're not 100% precise. So you do something useful until you figure out what can and must be done. Yeah, this is one important thing to keep in mind, because before you start working in a team, you think a certain way. After you start working with a team, you see how things are in the real world, maybe your position changes a little bit. So basically, you don't know what the objectives are and what should be done, as it is the case with the top-down approach. Why? Because you don't know the conditions, you don't know the players, you don't know the equipment, you don't know the facilities. Basically, you just, if you make a plan beforehand, it's just because or just to satisfy the board, the people that gave you the job, and nothing else that will actually help you in real life, or maybe for your own amusement or practice. So imagine you have two different scenarios. First one is bottom up. We will start on the right side. I have 3 barbells, 2 dumbbells, 2 Bosu balls, 1 squat stand, and athletes who have never lifted more than 50 kilos in their life. Okay, you made this complex plan. What are you gonna do now when you have athletes that don't have a clue and you have very limited equipment? So here is where the MVP plan comes in handy. Well, at the same time, you're trying to make them better, improve them. On the other hand, you're still trying to build trust, obviously, with the athletes, at the same time with the coaches, with the board, the management, with everybody who you have to satisfy to do a good job and to keep your job, obviously. On the other hand, we have the top-down approach, as we said, where you have some kind of a vision. Okay, everybody wants strong, fast, and fit athletes. All the coaches, all the clubs, all the teams want that. How do we achieve that? Let's start at the beginning. Let's look at the level we are at and the equipment and facilities we have at hand. So it's hard then to start with certain phase or periodization framework that is modern at the time because of all the things that we have mentioned before. And if you plan before you have seen the athletes and facilities and equipment, very unlikely that that plan will work. But you still need to have some kind of a long-term plan, otherwise you can be considered clueless and you don't know how to do your job. So, as has been the case with the exercise classification, as has been the case with qualities and methods, so is the case here in periodization. Both approaches are important. This whole presentation is just meant to open your eyes for the other side as well, to use, in this case, top-down and bottom-up. As we said before, start with bottom-up, then transition to top-down when you get to know the athletes more, they get to learn, they become better, you can trust them more. So simply things should go in this manner, in my opinion at least. Also, another thing why I have made this presentation is because there is a lot of overemphasis in the contemporary planning and periodization literature on the the top-down approach. And young coaches come into the field and think, okay, I'll use this, and this, and then you come there and you see, oh, things are totally different. Usually in the textbooks we see ideal case scenarios, while in real life, rarely there are ideal case scenarios, and there is a lot of improvisation and a lot of thinking on your feet. So, and this is where all the thinking models that you have and you have used and this experimenting comes in handy, because you can always find a solution. If you, I don't know, you can always find an exercise that will work, what must be done, the MVP, if you know a lot of different ways. If all you know how to, I don't know, do stuff with the barbell and you don't have barbells, you have a problem. So you need to create that overload with what you have and who you work with in the time you have available. Simple as that. Okay, but not to say that I don't have an example of my microcycle periodization. Of course I have, and it's good to have, and you should have yours as well. This is something that I have done with the help of my colleague Robert Simonic. Basically, he has his model, and I have reviewed it and updated it for my current needs, for my current type of athletes, for my current situation. With maybe another team, different sport, it will change. But this is what I currently use with the first team. If working with youth athletes, this plan will be different. Maybe yours will include some other qualities that you have identified as important. This again goes to the analysis, in this case of handball, what is important, what is needed. And this only serves as a good starting point where you should start, and maybe to visually explain to the head coach or all the staff involved how and what you plan to work. Well, in real life, a lot of those things will change or maybe will look a little bit different, but on a sheet of paper, it always looks nice. So that's why sometimes we have to make things like this. So this is for my today's presentation. I hope you have learned something useful. Maybe I have opened up your mind a little bit, and if you're interested in anything, you can find me on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter even, or just send me an email. And I will try my best to get back to you. Again, I would like to thank Sasha Petra for the invite, for the opportunity to speak at this conference, and hope to see you soon. Bye bye.
我再给大家补充一下刚才这位讲师多蒙的这个他的讲课的这个内容的一些其他方面的这样一个扩充出来的这样一个信息啊。一个呢就是他讲的这个内容，大家其实可以关注这个网站啊，叫Complete Mental Retraining 啊。那么这个网站呢，其实啊，这个我们很多国内的一些公众号啊，也在翻译它网站当中的一些资讯啊。那么呃，他今天讲课的这个内容呢，其实是他跟这个网站的这个创始人他们之间合著了一本书啊，应该叫力量训练。我大概这个应该叫力量训练的这个，但这本书呢，应该是以电子版在亚马逊这个发售的啊。那么国内可能暂时看不了。那这是其中当中的这本书里面的一部分的内容啊，关于这个练习的选择。那我呢，刚才也在咱们的这个后台聊天区里面给了大家其中他在讲课当中提到的一个这个表格啊，这个 Jordan 的一个表格。那这个表格其实是对咱们进行跟力量有关训练是非常好的一个参照表啊。那么它后面包括提到的这个小周期，其实我们可以看到有一栏叫 duration，就是它的一直有一个叫做持续的时间。其实这个持续时间在这里面呢，实际上就是我们的叫压力给你的肌肉的这个时间啊。无论是他提到的慢速的，还是这个弹动式的啊，那么其实大家要有一个认识，就是它的在完成这两项练习的时候呢，都要是尽最大的主观意图的。啊，这个慢速不是说你主观上放慢，而是因为由于负重很大，导致了你的动作速度是没办法快速完成的啊。因此呢，这两种情况下都要求是在最大努力下去完成的。然后呢，如果你在最大努力下完成这个推举啊，它依然是慢速的，那证明这个负重已经是够重了。那所以它就分成了这两类，一个是慢速的，一个是弹震式的、弹动式的。那么我们在具体的分析的时候，究竟这两类练习能带给我们解剖学上面的一个是神经适应还是肌肉适应？那我们就可以参照这个表格啊，大家可以看一下这个表格。这个表格里面其实就已经很详细的划分出来有三个区啊，动态努力区、最大努力区和重复努力区。然后在每个区里面，它都有一个指向，是指向了你的功率，还是指向了你的最大力量。当你完成了这个最大组数、最大次数，或者是最大重复的这样一个慢速的力竭的时候呢，可能就是针对的你的这个肌肥大啊。如果你没有进入到这样一个力竭情况下呢，就是针对你的肌耐力。所以这个表格呢，我觉得大家可以保存一下，然后呢去呃在咱们的这个力量训练过程当中可以去参考啊。我就补充一下这个信息啊。